Okay, so in today's video, I'm going to be talking about why we need to study the ideal and, of course, the ideology. And I'm also going to be talking about the capitalist and socialist tendencies in the USSR and what it means for us today. So, as usual, I am relying heavily upon Marina Burik's work, A Virtualized World of Capitalism. The comrades and I are pretty close to finishing the book, and we're most likely going to meet with the author once again upon the completion of the book to ask our final questions. And it's very nice to be able to converse with the author directly. I am going to insist that we need to study the ideal. And this is something that is argued about not only amongst the people outside of the leftist circles, who often wonder why the lefties are so preoccupied with learning theory and studying the ideology and studying the ideal. Oftentimes because there isn't much in the public discourse about what the ideal actually is. But also amongst Marxists themselves, there is a huge conversation, let's put it this way, about the necessity of studying the ideal. Ilyenkov, for example, who I referenced in the past, actually met with some backlash in the Soviet Union from Marxists who were arguing a lot with his dialectical approaches to looking at the world and the sciences, because at the point when Ilyenkov was creating and writing, there was a lot of dogma already ruling over not only the party, but the population generally has become much more accustomed to dogma. And this is something that is very, very common for the people to kind of slide into dogma, because it's so much easier to just believe certain slogans. It's much easier to just follow orders and whatever, and just remember the good old days and the victories, etc. So it's much harder to continuously apply the dialectical method. It is also kind of boring to keep on questioning everything, right? And it's kind of annoying, and it kind of goes against our intuitive desire, seemingly intuitive desire, to put everything in neat little black or white boxes, etc., etc. So these common tendencies is what I think makes this conversation continue to this day, where some Marxists insist upon a more pragmatic approach, saying that us sitting and talking about theory is not helping the movement, is not helping the revolution, and we should get out there onto the streets, etc., etc. So I am going to advocate for the study of the ideal. Instead, I am going to provide a few reasons that I've gathered from my own personal experiences and I have been promoting here on my channel for the past few years. But of course, I don't argue ever with a more pragmatic approach. I am really, really drawn to pragmatism, honestly. I wish we actually did something, and I did personally did things without studying them first, and I did fail in some of these things, in my opinion, even though the union work that I've done generally ended up in pretty significant economic gains for the workers at my school. If you're interested, I have a playlist dedicated to the union work that I was a part of. But yeah, I personally learned from experience that it's actually best to actually sit down and study the circumstances you're in, the environment you're in, the people you are planning to organize with. You've got to understand them concretely. You cannot just come in willy-nilly, tell people this is the plan, this is how we're going to do it, you guys are supposed to follow my orders, and I'm a nobody to you, right? So this is what I often see some of the people who are a little bit more pragmatic fall into. They unfortunately become these nobodies who scream very loudly at other people, and other people are kind of they're not very engaged. They're not very willing to participate in whatever this person may be promoting, even if this person is promoting something extremely necessary and useful and amazing. At the end of the day, we do have to learn our conditions and environment first before we jump into action, right? But the formation of the ideal is something that I specifically insist upon studying and taking a closer look at, and I'm going to include a couple of those works of Ilyenkov that I included before. I'm not really referencing much of Ilyenkov because he is notoriously a little bit hard to understand, and by a little I mean a lot, because he is not easy to understand. If you're not used to the whole philosophical lingo, you're going to get stuck at first, unless of course you're very talented and very good at reading and comprehending literature, then maybe you are not going to be stuck. But many people, upon their first reading of Ilyenkov, they're kind of like, I don't understand what's happening, can you please give me a translation? So it is great when you read it with other people. And this is how I was able to make sense of a lot of what Ilyenkov has written in some of his works. Of course, I didn't read everything, but because I was able to study it with other people who explained some of the things, and some of these things we kind of figured out on the go. So I'm not claiming to be an expert, right? I'm not a philosopher. I have never studied philosophy professionally, but the ideal, the formation of the ideal, Ilyenkov suggests, and this is a broad Marxist view of the ideal, it's not just Ilyenkov's, that the ideal is derived from the material. The thoughts and the ideas that we get about the world is inspired completely by our material world. It is not coming out of some spirit. It is not coming out of some inspiration from the supernatural. It is the material conditions that dictate the way we think about it. And specific conditions breed specific ideas. And then, because it is a dialectical relationship, because the ideal is a moment of the material, and this is something that I've shared before, the material, through our mind processes, through the way our body interacts with their environment, it is able to produce thought. It is able to produce something that is intangible, right? You cannot touch your ideas when you're just thinking them, and sometimes you cannot even put them into words. You cannot even express them to others, yet you have them. It is for some people it's pictures, for some people it's some kind of a sound, for some people it may even be incomprehensible to themselves, but it is generally some kind of a perception that the mind is capable of, which we call consciousness. And then it is a reflection of the material world. We see something happen, we see a phenomenon, and we think and we decide this is what it is, this is what it means, etc. So the ideal is the moment of the material, because without the material something happening, and without the material apparatus of the human brain paired with all the circumstances that led to the formation of consciousness, the thought process of the ideal therefore would not be possible. And also the material shapes the ideal by the presence of the internal objects of things. So everything has its own logic, right? And by this, it means that every single thing is going to act according to the rules that we as conscious beings can study. So we can observe the patterns of nature. We can observe how the seasons change, how the weather changes. We can observe how plants grow, how animals interact with themselves and the environment, etc., etc. And therefore, we are able to not only learn the logic of things, but also think of how to possibly change that logic in order for this object that we're studying to serve us better or to suit our needs, etc., etc. So therefore, again, any kind of an ideology is this desire, right? It is this desire to control the environment so it is more suitable for human needs or the perceived human needs. And when you study the ideology from this viewpoint, when you understand that this is absolutely something that cannot exist without the material, then you notice that the ideal then starts influencing the material. So when you take a stone, right, it has its own logic. The molecules in the stone move very slowly, therefore it holds its shape. By the way, if you can hear some sounds, it is probably the thunderstorm that is brewing outside. So the stone has its own logic, right? The molecules in the stone move in a particular manner, so it takes a longer time to change if we compare it for, let's say, wood or any kind of organic matter. And then we use the logic of that stone to create something for ourselves, right? The stone can be an axe, the stone can be a statue, the stone can be any kind of tool that we can imagine, right? That we can create in our minds. And this picture in our minds, this imaginings of ours, this is the moment of the ideal. And then when we transform through labor that stone into whatever we imagined before, this is when our ideal becomes the new material. So this stone no longer follows the logic of its nature. It is now following the logic of a human. It is following the logic of the ideal of the human. So this is when the ideal becomes the material. So when you look at the object that has been created out of the stone, it is no longer an object of nature. It is now the object of human labor, and it now bears the stamp of the ideal. So Ilyenkov used this wonderful phrase, the stamp of the ideal. So I like to paraphrase it like this. So everything in the human world that has been created by humans has the stamp of the ideal, because it has all of those thought patterns, all of those ideas and imaginings that a human might have had in this object. So everything that we use in our day-to-day lives, even the things that were grown in the soil, they all have the stamp of the ideal because it had human labor applied to it, and it had been transformed to suit not the logic of this particular object, but the logic of the human world, of the human consumption. So it now suits the needs of the humans. Now it fulfills the needs of the humans instead of fulfilling some other internal processes that it may undergo. Because if you leave the stone alone, it's just going to be there, right? For a long, long time, maybe for hundreds of years, depending on its environment, it may actually be preserved in its original form for thousands of years. And this is the logic of a stone, right? It doesn't really change much, but the human ideal, the human thoughts can transform that object into something completely different, and it's going to bear the stamp. So the other generations that may lose connection with the previous generations, they will still be able to study the logic of the ideal of the previous generations by looking at the tools, by looking at the stones and other objects that have been transformed by human labor. And this is why I insist we need to study the ideal, because everything starts making so much more sense. Because then, after you understand what the ideal is and its connection, the connection that is absolutely impossible to disentangle from the material, then you come to the study of the ideology. Because this is when you start seeing the general patterns emerge of human behavior throughout history, and you also start understanding that the way people have been building and recreating their life is not according, oftentimes is not according to the actual human needs. And then you realize that it is according to some other needs that humans may also have, like the need to establish yourself, the need to assert yourself over others, the need to prove to yourself that you're worthy of love and respect, etc., etc. And these are just some basic things that arise from trauma. And when you study the history of capitalism, it is apparent, it becomes pretty quickly apparent that it is not the logical, cohesive way the human societies should develop or would develop otherwise. But this, for those circumstances, and this is also kind of a controversial thing to say because not every Marxist is going to agree. Some Marxists actually insist that no matter what, capitalism would still emerge because it is, building up over all these other socioeconomic formations. But I personally believe, as many indigenous Marxist beliefs as well, people who practice non-Marxist communism, actually, it is not, they don't call themselves Marxists, they call themselves indigenous non-Marxist communists, as far as I remember. So I also share this belief with them that there was absolutely an alternative way for people to come out of, primitive communism, and instead of primitive accumulation, other things could have emerged, and they did. Some anthropologists actually studied a lot of different native peoples who preserved a lot of ways. So they studied like gift economies, they studied all the reciprocity type of economies of the past, which were able to sustain themselves for a long time. So it wasn't necessarily inevitable that capitalism came to be, but it did, right? There was this certain branch of development of humankind. I'm not going to call it evolution because I don't think it is, but that led to certain economic outcomes, certain economic type of production emerge, and we can study this and understand why it happened. And I already recommended many works by Erich Fromm, because he is the one who I believe has done a great service to us by studying the ideology of capitalism. And because of his research and findings, we can see that many of these patterns, they are pathological, right? So a lot of the capitalist patterns of behavior is not inherently human behavior. It is a form of behavior that humans are capable of, but it is not a necessity. It's not something that is going to necessarily replicate itself. It is not actually very energy efficient. It is not very socially progressive and forward, etc., etc. But I have a ton of videos about Erich Fromm if you're interested. So going back to the fact that when you start studying ideology, this is when you start realizing that the ideology of capitalism does not serve people, right? It is very harmful. It is based off of a lot of pathological assumptions about what humans are and what they need. So then this is when you come to the socialist and capitalist tendencies. Every single one of us who thinks hard about why the world is the way it is, we will have some capitalist tendencies instilled into us. Call it indoctrination, call it programming, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. But what it does, it leads to us replicating some of the processes of capitalist ideological formation, or the ideal formation. And therefore, we have this internal fight between socialist and capitalist tendencies within ourselves. And when we deny that, we shoot ourselves in the foot, because we then may accidentally replicate all kinds of oppression if we attempt to build a certain type of a project, or even in our interpersonal relationships. And then this is where I just want to talk briefly about Marina Burik's analysis of the socialist and capitalist tendencies in the USSR, which she does at the beginning of this book that I earlier mentioned. And it was pretty obvious to anyone who studied the Soviet history in any amount of detail that the capitalist tendencies persisted throughout the entire history of the USSR. And that was, again, inevitable, because some kind of an ideology and some kind of economic processes, they do not just disappear completely. They are not forgotten very easily. You cannot just press a reset button and start afresh. The revolutionary changes were vast in the early history and the entire history of the Soviet period, really. But those capitalist tendencies persisted because it's only been 70 plus years. I'm not good with remembering numbers, so forgive me. But it only persisted for a couple of generations at most. So it really didn't have enough time to undo all of that damage that capitalism did to the people's minds and to their psyches. And also because there were a lot of economic changes that had to happen in order to industrialize and develop all of the different areas of the Soviet territories, of the Soviet republics, I should say, because if I say territory, somebody is going to jump in the comments and say that it was colonialist bad, therefore, but I already have a few videos where I talk about why I don't think so. So going back to the socialist and capitalist tendencies, they were inevitable because of the time frame it was happening, because Russia was an empire before and it had to disentangle itself, right? So same goes to a lot of the other republics that suffered all kinds of earlier influences, and of course those tendencies existed, and because there was no cohesive ideology proposed that was based on the actual study. There were attempts, just like Ilyenkov points out and a lot of other researchers do. He himself was the one who was trying to derive that new communist ideology, just like Lenin would have said. Again, it is something that is argued about in Marxist circles, whether communist ideology even should exist or if it's going to be just pure science that we are operating from. But Ilyenkov did put a lot of effort into developing this communist ideology by understanding the world, right? By trying to understand how our new ideal actually forms. Are we able to just pretend that we call everything that's capitalist bad, and we just make up stuff seemingly out of nowhere? And of course, it is not possible. You're going to build off of the legacy of the past, and if your legacy is based on capitalist ideology and on capitalist economic production, of course, you're going to inevitably replicate some of these patterns. So you have to be very conscious. And unfortunately, in the during the Soviet period, that was not really happening. And I did talk about some of the reasons as to why. And of course, it was the lack of resources, the human loss that we endured in the wars, the necessity for faster development in order to not be suppressed by the Western Empire, etc., etc. So there were many reasons. So the people started following their capitalist tendencies a lot more, and the restoration ultimately of capitalism happened. And a lot of people were not even sure what capitalism was, because to keep the educational system as progressive as possible and as advanced as possible, you do need to have a developed economy, and you do need to be pouring a lot of resources. And they did pour a lot of resources into education, but apparently not enough. So the ideological study and the study of the ideal didn't happen at the scale that was necessary in the Soviet Union, and that was one of the reasons why the Soviet project failed. And I did talk on multiple occasions about all the different reasons. Same goes for you as a person, same goes for me as a person. Individually, we also have capitalist and socialist tendencies. So we have to figure out why we have certain thoughts, why we think something is better. We have to use all the tools, the dialectical method being the most useful and the most pragmatic tool. We have to look for a core contradiction in ourselves, in our behaviors, in our interactions, in every single thing we do. We do have to sometimes become very nitpicky about even the choice of words, etc., etc. And this is what is going to help us create this, or help develop rather, not create, help develop the new ideology that is going to help humanity not fail another socialist project, which we are most likely not going to be able to participate in building of, but we help raise the people who are going to most likely be able to do that. So we need to make sure that we don't let the capitalist tendencies win. And this is why I think it is absolutely necessary to deconstruct capitalist ideology, to understand why certain notions came to be. And this is why I do what I do, talking about all those unconscious biases, all of these preconceived notions, etc., etc. So hopefully more people do that, more people try and understand why and how capitalism lives in our brain, and that we cannot just learn economics, we have to learn the philosophy as well. So let me know what you think, ask questions if you have any. I hope you have a great day today. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Do take care of yourself and your community first. Subscribe to me on all the social media, even though I don't do much there, and I'll talk to you sometime later.